psychologist with Down Syndrome Education International. She was awarded the first-class BSc degree in psychology from the University of Strand, Lancashire, and later received a BSc from the institution. Over the past couple of years, she has supported a large number of children with Down syndrome in school and worked closely with school teaching assistants to develop teaching for individual children. She has also written and delivered training to parents and educators. I'm glad she's here with us today, and her presence in this conference as an added advantage and also in the days to follow. So I'm most honored, and I would be very grateful if you would help me welcome to the stage Dr. Kelly Burgoyne.
I think I'm more nervous than you. Oh no, we don't want that on the screen. Let's get that off. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Pleasure to be here, and really nice to be the first keynote speaker of the day. I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you about reading, which is a real passion of mine. And I hope that by the end of the day, if all you've got in your head is I must teach my child to read, then I've done my job properly, and I'll be a very happy lady. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. If I can get the slides to move on. Okay, so we're going to start by thinking about why we should teach reading. So what's important about teaching children to read. And then we're going to have a quick look at what we know about reading skills in children with Down syndrome. And then, most importantly, we're going to think about what the teaching of reading should look like. So what we should be including and when, and the kinds of activities and the kinds of resources that you'd be using in your teaching. Can I just get a hands up, actually? I'm not sure who I'm talking to. How many of you in the audience are parents? And how many are educators, school staff? Oh, lovely, so a nice mix. Any speech and language therapists? No? Okay. Okay, thank you. That helps me to know who I'm talking to today. So I would like to start off with a quote that I think sums up how I feel about what we know about reading for children with Down syndrome. So this is a quote from Elizabeth K. Raining-Bird and Robin Chapman, that says we may be just beginning to understand the true capabilities of these individuals with regards to literacy development. I think that's very true. I think we've come a long way in the last 30 to 40 years. I mean, when you think of, that's not that long ago really, is it, 30 to 40 years ago? But at that time we didn't think that, the general consensus was that it wasn't worth teaching children with Down syndrome to read because they couldn't learn. So what was the point in teaching them? And now we know that that's just not true. And we also know much more about the best ways to help children learn to read. So we know much more, and that's not to say that we know everything. We still have lots of questions that are left to answer. But we've come quite a long way, and I'm hoping to be able to share some of that knowledge with you today. And it's an exciting time for reading with children with Down syndrome. So let's think a bit about why we should be thinking about teaching reading to this group of children. And I would argue that for this group of children, teaching them to read is particularly important. So firstly, reading is a really important goal in itself. It's important for personal pleasure. So many of us, including myself, read because I enjoy reading. It's a pastime I enjoy taking part in. It also enables us to access the curriculum. So through reading, we learn about the world, history, geography, science. We get information about the world and able to access the educational curriculum through what we read. So it's really important for our academic development. Thinking beyond the school years, if you're a reader, then you have more opportunities for employment post-school years. So there are more job opportunities available to you if you can read. That applies to all of us. It's also really important for our independent living. So we have cinema listings. You can't access those and understand what's on at the cinema if you can't read the cinema listings. A recipe to make your amazing butter chicken. You can't access that recipe if you can't read the ingredients list and the method. And train station signs. You know, if you can't read the signs, you can't travel independently. So to be an independent adult, you really need to be able to read. Now, there's a few more reasons why reading is particularly important for our children. We all know that children with Down syndrome have particular difficulties learning from listening. They've got poor verbal short-term memory skills, and that means learning from listening, taking in and processing auditory information is really very difficult. Relative to that, they have these strengths in visual learning. Print, of course, is a visual tool. It's a visual resource that we can exploit to make use of those visual learning strengths. Print also stays where it is, unlike speech. So my last sentence has already gone, whereas if it was written down, you could go back to it and you could check that you'd understood properly what it said. So print has many qualities that tie in very well with what we know about the strengths and the weaknesses that children with Down syndrome face when they are coming to a learning task. Reading might also support language development. So language is, of course, another big area of difficulty for individuals with Down syndrome. And finding ways to support language learning is really important. Now, reading activities can be used to help teach children new vocabulary and new grammatical structures. We know from experimental work that actually seeing the word in print helps children to learn new spoken words. So we know we've got evidence that having a word in print helps us learn new vocabulary. Reading activities also help children, give them more practice in terms of articulating speech sounds, saying words, and using full sentences. And we've spoken a lot over the last day about how important that extra practice is. So reading activities give us that extra practice that we need. And lastly, activities that are involved around spelling and phonics work also provide practice in articulation and phonology, which are important for our speech intelligibility. So for all of these reasons, I would argue that taking part in reading and learning to read is particularly important for children with Down syndrome. So I have a clip here, which won't play there, so I'll just play it here, which I think illustrates some of those points I was just making. So I'd like to show you the lovely Larkin. No sound? We had sound earlier. I'm not sure why we don't have sound now. You're kind of getting a sneak preview. Hopefully it will play with sound in a second. I'll just tell you a little bit about Larkin while we're waiting. So Larkin is very, very small for her age. So she is 4 in this clip. She spent a long time in hospital when she was born because she had a lot of heart problems. So she spent a long time in hospital, but Mum has done so much work with her. Her speech is amazing. She uses full sentences. She says things like, "You don't wear rings, do you, Mummy?" She is an accomplished kettle drum player. She has a brother who is also very gifted and talented. He's off to secondary school at the age of 8. So there's obviously very good genetic endowment there within the family. But Mum has put so much work in with Larkin, and she has got amazing reading skills, amazing language, and she's an example of what's possible, I think. So we'll see if we can play it with sound. Do we think it'll play?
I'll bring you on.
Sorry, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to play.
Sad.
That's a shame. You can hear it.
Who's in the picture? Can you find Mummy's name? She's sad, but can you find her name first?
Who is sad? Can you find the picture, the name? That's it. Let's have a look then at the sentence. You read it for me then. Okay. Yeah. Sad or sad? Sad or sad? Try with the sad. Sad. Yeah, say your so nice and loud. Sad. Good girl, Mummy is sad.
Isn't she amazing? Okay, so I hope that illustrates, I think that illustrates really quite well that these kinds of activities, which are quite simple in many ways, give children lots of practice at understanding print, so understanding that there's meaning attached to these words, in understanding the order of words, so she was learning that they went in a particular order, which is of course our grammatical knowledge. It also forced her to use that little is word in the middle, which is so often left out of speech. So it draws attention to those important words that are often missed. And of course, we had that lovely practice at the s at the beginning of sad. So in all of these ways, that very simple reading activity was really helping to move Larkin's language forward. I hope I've convinced you all that it's really important to teach our children to read. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about what we know about this group of children and what they are able to achieve in terms of reading. And again, I would say this is what we know now based on the teaching that we give children. And I think we're only moving forward in our understanding of how best to teach and moving forward in giving all children access to that good quality teaching. But this is what we know now. So papers report a wide range of achievements in reading. So as with all things with this group of learners, we have a very wide range, so huge variability between different individuals. We have about 10% of children who are able to read. So here I'm talking about word reading. About 10% of children learn to read at an age-appropriate level. Now that's not mental age appropriate level. I'm talking chronological age level. So a child who's 6 is reading at a typically developing child who's 6. Okay, so some of our children are the best readers in a mainstream classroom. Those children who were started early, some of them are the best readers in a class full of typically developing children, which is just incredible, isn't it? Now, not all children read at that level. As I said, we've got really wide range of individual differences. We don't yet know who this 10% are. So I can't stand here and say to you, if you have a child who has, incredible language and can do this and can do this, then they will be one of those 10%, because at the minute we just don't know. It's not possible to predict who is going to take off with their reading and who is going to struggle. So that means that we have to give everybody the same opportunities to learn, because we don't know who's going to find it hard and who's going to find it difficult. Reading abilities have been demonstrated from the age of 3, so from a young age. I was speaking to a mother yesterday who I hope is in the audience. I can't just spot her, but she might be here, who was telling me that her 3.5-year-old son has about 30 sight words, which is brilliant. And I said, you're doing all the right things, this is fantastic. So we can start from a very early age. And what that means is, if your child starts school with a level of reading ability already, so he can show what he can do, then that's a real punch in the face to any educator who doesn't believe that this child belongs in that school. And it's a real you know, we need to be teaching these children things because they can learn. We know that for many children, their decoding skills, so that's being able to sound out and blend, so having the letters k, a, t, and being able to read cat, that's decoding. We know that that's more difficult than it is to read words by sight. So word recognition is typically better than decoding skills, and that's because children really struggle with phonological awareness, and that's all about our ability to manipulate the sounds in words that we hear. So because that's difficult, children often struggle with decoding, but with teaching and with experience, they get it, okay? So I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second, but decoding's tough. Reading comprehension is also an area of difficulty, so that's being able to understand what we read, and that's often very difficult for them as well. But again, you know, with good instruction, we get there. So involvement in literacy activities will benefit everybody, even if they're not yet independent. So even if they're, you know, still at an early stage with their reading, then taking part in these literacy activities will still be of benefit. But their difficulties mean that for this group of children, reading instruction really needs to be much more structured, much more focused and intensive, and go on for longer than it does for other children. So there are some other adaptations that we need to think about. So I'm going to argue that actually reading instruction for this group of children should look the same as it does for everybody else. Having said which, because we've got our particular profile, then we need to take account of that in our teaching in a number of ways. So, for example, we know that we've got cognitive delay, so slower learning. And that means that we need to build in really small steps, so we're not jumping too far ahead when we're moving our targets forward. We need to have very intensive daily instruction, so this needs to be happening every day with lots of opportunities for that revision and consolidation, because we know sometimes learning's like that, isn't it? We've got it, oh, where's it gone? It's dropped off. So we need lots of opportunities to revise what we've already ticked off as learnt. We know, as we said earlier, that children have difficulties particularly with verbal short-term memory, whereas visual learning is typically a strength. So we need to build in those visual supports for learning where we can. Delayed language is also going to impact on our ability to learn to read, so we need to really work on those language skills alongside teaching children to read. So those things should be done together. We have difficulties with comprehension, so we need to emphasise and support reading for meaning from the very outset of reading instruction, so that children understand that this is all about getting something out of the text, understanding what we read. We know that there are difficulties with phonological awareness and phonics, so we need to give children explicit instruction and frequent practice of those skills alongside the sight word stuff, which is traditionally a strength. Some of our children have short-term attention spans, and there can sometimes be difficulties with behaviour. So we build in very short, varied activities and teaching approaches that ensure success. I'm going to come back and demonstrate or illustrate to you a sequence, a programme, which incorporates these adaptations, but we'll just leave that aside for now. So, what do we need to do? Well, firstly, we need to start teaching reading early. So we know that children can start to learn to read from about 2 to 3 years. We know that this will help them, and as we said, that's a very important foundation for starting school. So I would argue that starting reading at an early age is very important. We start by teaching a small sight vocabulary first. So this is teaching words as whole sight words. And we start that with preschool children, typically when they understand about 50 to 100 words, and when they're able to match and select pictures, then they're kind of ready to be introduced to starting learning to read. So when they're about 2.5 to 3.5 years of age. Start by choosing words that the child understands and finds motivating, and in many instances that might be something like family names or cartoon characters, something that they're going to want to learn to read and that's motivating for them and that has meaning for them. And we introduce words through a hierarchy of matching, selecting and naming. Once children have a small bank of sight words, then we start to build them up into sentences. So once you've got a few family names, for example, you want to start introducing some other types of words so you can start building them up into sentences. So you might introduce, for example, eating, drinking, sleeping, again, words that the child knows, and then you can start building sentences like mummy is eating, daddy is sleeping, etc., etc. So short, grammatically correct sentences. Always read the words and the sentences with the child when they're learning and use those errorless learning techniques to ensure that they always get it right, so we're not putting them off. And make books using pictures of the child's own world and their interest to illustrate those sentences. So we have a picture that goes along with the sentence, so they have a clue to the meaning of the sentence and it's more engaging, more appealing for them. So there's a programme available published by Down Syndrome Education International which uses this sight word approach as a way to support language development in the early years. This is called See and Learn. Have you heard of See and Learn? Yes. Okay, so this resource is available, as you know, and there are a number of apps now, and there's online training. So if you go to the DSE website, you can find more information about See and Learn on there. But the things I've been talking about, you can make resources yourself. You don't need to buy these things. They're all things you can make very easily yourself, but it's there if you wanted to look at it. Okay, so reading involves much more than just sight word reading, and to be a skilled reader, we need to have a strategy that enables us to read words that we've not been taught. So the limit of a sight word strategy is that you can only ever read words that somebody has taught to you using a sight word strategy. If you come across a word that you've never seen before, you've got no way of working out what it says. So we need a phonics-based reading approach to be able to decode, to sound out and blend words that we've never seen before. So we need to be teaching children those skills and giving them those strategies in order for them to become effective, independent readers. There's now good evidence to suggest that these kinds of phonics-based reading programs are effective for our group of learners. So there are a number of studies now, good quality studies, which show significant gains in targeted reading skills following these types of programs. So in these types of programs, they contain all the different components that we know are important for all children learning to read. And that is letter sound knowledge, so we're teaching children the sounds of letters. Phonological awareness, so that's being able to manipulate the sounds in the words that we hear. And those two things together are what we mean by phonics. So this is a phonics-based approach. We also want to incorporate sight words because that's a really important tool in itself, and some of the words in the English language we can't read by sounding out and blending, so we have to teach some words as sight words, so we include that as well. And we do all that in the context of book reading, so giving children opportunities and practice at reading real books with words in. Too many times I see children in school with wordless picture books. We need to be giving children lots of experience of reading the same books that all the other children in classrooms are reading with words in. So we designed and evaluated a program which incorporated all of those different components. Now, we also built in a language element to this program. You remember I said earlier that it's because of those language delays, it's important that we target language explicitly. So this particular program is a combined reading and language program which builds all those things in together. And we evaluated this program in a big study and showed that we had significant gains in many of our reading and early language skills compared to teaching as usual. So this program is effective in supporting children's reading and language development. Again, this is published by Down Syndrome Education International. It's available to you. What I would say is, as I said for See and Learn, all of the things that I've said in that last slide, so all of these things are true. So you don't need to buy this program to do all of those things. But it is available for those of you who feel it would help. Okay? So the program is based on daily, so every day we're working on these activities with children in a one-to-one educational setting. So this was delivered in school by trained teaching assistants who were working with the children in school. And they worked on this program every day on the two different components, a reading strand and a language strand. It's a prescribed program set out in a manual, so it's all fully scripted. And it looks like this. So the reading strand is 20-minute session, and the language strand is a 20-minute session. So in the reading strand, we've got all of those things that I said on that other slide were important. So we've got book reading in there. You'll see on a few of the rows, we've got book reading. We've also got sight word learning, and we've got work on letters, sounds, and phonology. So it's building in all those different things. With our language strand, we have introducing new words and reinforcing the meaning of new words. So we're giving children new vocabulary. We're also working on using that new vocabulary in expressive language, so being able to use that in our speech, working on words and sentences. Note that we have suggested timings for each of these things. You know what I said earlier about short, varied activities? So this is different. We're working on reading reading and language for 40 minutes, right? So which is quite a long time, isn't it? But we're doing it in lots of different ways. So we're not just reading a book for 40 minutes, because that would be boring, and children wouldn't be there for very long. But because we're targeting reading, but we're targeting it coming from lots of different directions with different activities, all targeting reading, but in different ways, for just a short length of time. It helps to keep children's attention, helps to keep them focused, and all of our children were able to attend for at least the 20-minute sessions. So some of our schools did it in 2 separate 20-minute sessions. Some did it in a full 40-minute session. But because we've built in those short, varied activities, that helps to keep children engaged. So I'm going to leave word reading to one side and think about reading comprehension. So this is understanding what we read. And remember that we said that this was a particular area of difficulty. And that's for a number of reasons. Reading comprehension, it makes heavy demands on our language skills. So if we don't know the words and we don't understand word order and grammar, then we're going to find it very hard to understand what we read. Similarly, it makes really heavy demands on our memory, because we have to keep track of what's happening in a story. So that's difficult for our children. And because of these reasons, they find reading comprehension really hard. Reading comprehension actually also is reliant on several other skills. One of those is something called inferencing, because it's very rare that you have a piece of text where everything is stated outright in text. So often we have to make predictions about what's happening based on our general knowledge, based on what we know happened before in the story, etc., etc. So inferencing is about making predictions and going beyond the text, and that's really hard for our children too. Comprehension also depends on several strategies, including our ability to ask questions about a story and to answer those questions, our ability to summarize, and our ability to monitor our understanding. It also makes demands on our story understanding or narrative skills, so that's things like sequencing and story structure. It also depends on how bothered we are about understanding what we read. So if you come to a reading activity and you're not really bothered whether you understand it or not, then you're not going to have good comprehension. But if you do have a powerful drive to understand what you've read, then you're going to have better comprehension. So all of these things affect how well we understand what we read. Now, we need to make sure that we support reading comprehension from the very outset of reading instruction. So right from the very beginning, when you start teaching your child to read, be thinking about supporting their ability to understand. So activities like matching words and sentences to pictures, to meaning, really help to reinforce to children that this is what reading is about. Talking about books and stories as well with children really helps them to understand that, oh, actually I've got to understand what this means. Make sure you utilise those visual learning strengths, so make use of picture cues that are in the story and provide pictures when learning new words. Think about writing, so this is for older children, think about writing your questions down so they've got that in print as a visual support, and maybe highlighting some of those key words in the question as a clue to help them understand what it is you want them to answer with. And make it meaningful for children. So link stories, link books to their kind of personal experiences. You know, ask them if the story's about the beach or whatever. Oh, when did you last go to the beach and what did you there? Do you think they'll do that in the story? Those kinds of questionings, those kinds of interactions can help support reading comprehension. We also need to pay attention to vocabulary and grammar. So look at the words and the sentence structures in the story. Think about, does my child understand those words and sentences? Don't make assumptions that they do. Maybe check it. Teach those words and sentences if they don't understand them. Do some specific work on questions. So working on asking questions of each other and answering questions will help. And understanding what those question words mean. So questions like where are always about, you know, a place. Questions about who are always about a person. So having that understanding will help children to key into what it is that particular comprehension questions are asking them to answer with. So maybe do some specific work on understanding those question words. Model and scaffold good reading strategies. So we'll look back in the story to help them answer the question. So model that for children. Oh, I'm not sure what the answer to this question is, so I'm going to look back and find it. And the more that you model these things, the more that they'll start doing them and taking on these strategies themselves. And work on narratives. So do activities like sequencing pictures from stories, coming up with sentences which summarise those pictures, and then using those sentences and those pictures to retell stories. That will help support narrative. Okay, so we've ignored spelling and writing, but let's have a moment to just think about it because this is an important part of our literacy skills. So working on spelling and writing can be targeted alongside many of our reading activities we've been talking about. So for example, sight word work, we can copy and trace the flashcards that we're working on. For letters, sounds and phonology activities, we can work on making letter shapes, writing activities and using magnetic letters if writing's still tricky. For book reading and comprehension, we can work on writing sentences that match the pictures that we're sequencing and writing predictions about what happens next. And that rehearsal method of look, cover, write and check is really useful for all kinds of writing activities. Okay, so the key messages as I see them, so if you go away with nothing more from my talk, please go away with these points. Learning to read is an important goal for all children with Down syndrome. All children should be given the opportunity to learn to read. Starting early at preschool using that sight word reading approach gives children a really strong foundation. But effective reading instruction needs to be much more than sight word reading on its own, so we need to think about teaching children their letter sounds. We need to think about working on giving them that phonics-based reading approach. We also need to target reading comprehension because that's a particular area of challenge. So all these things we need to include. Fundamentally, the teaching that we've been talking about is, you know, appropriate across settings, so for mainstream schools, but also for special schools, and it can be delivered by adults at school and at home. So I hope that's given you some ideas. I hope it's given you some way forward. I'd like to acknowledge two of my mentors. Firstly, Professor Charles Hume, who at the University of Oxford, and Professor Sue Buckley, who I think you all will know from Down Syndrome Education International, as well as all the children I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 10 years or so now. There are some resources there for you, including the links to the See and Learn resources and reading and language intervention, but they're just available on DSE website. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to be here in India and to meet many of you. I hope that's been useful for you, and enjoy the rest of the day.
We wanted to start with sight words. They said, no, we are teaching for phonetics and sight words cannot go with that. So we avoided doing sight words, and now after a few years, now we are trying to start it again. So is it good or bad?
Sight words. Yes, okay. It's interesting this, isn't it? Because for many years we had the view that sight words was the only way to do it. And now it sounds as if we're not doing sight words at all. So sight words are really important for all children. So typically developing children and as well all children. And the reason for that is in English, there are many words that can't be decoded. So we can't use a phonological reading strategy for many words in English. We have to read them by sight. So we have to be taught them by sight. So what they've said to you is absolute rubbish. But what I would say, if you come across attitudes like that, just do it at home. Just do it at home, fine.
I'd just like to support whatever you said. So my son started reading very young, and primarily I was just looking through books and helping him read. But when he started schooling, of course, there was this phonetics method that people had to start with. But thankfully, I found a teacher who decided she will go with the sight words. And in about hardly 2 months, he had a vocabulary of more than 200 words, which was wonderful. And he still struggles with phonetics, but with sight words he's really able to read fast. Right now he can read quite well, so I would really subscribe to the sight reading.
Thank you. One other thing I will say is that you're quite right. So for some children, sight words they take off with and they struggle with the phonological stuff. And that's not true for all children. There are some children who really just don't get the sight words. They just don't get it. And parents and educators start thinking, if they're of the mindset that that's the only way, which some are, they start thinking this kid can't read. This child's never going to learn to read because they're not getting the sight words. But then they introduce the other strategy and they get that. So, don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, because it isn't. Yeah, but thank you very much for sharing your experience.
Hi. My son is much older. He speaks 4 languages, but unfortunately he cannot read. So my question to you is, can an older child be taught how to read?
Good question. Yes, they can. At any age, they can be taught to read using the principles and the strategies that we've talked about. There are extra complications for older readers. One of those is that many of the resources that we have for teaching reading are for a much younger person, and we only learn things that we want to learn. So that means that it's harder to find resources that are engaging for older learners. But if you can do that, and I would say use the web as your friend. So download things he's interested in. If he's interested in cars, for example, get pictures of cars and write out, or films, then make your resources based around films. So whatever's interesting for him, and make words and make sentences. But all of the things that we've talked about are just as applicable for older readers.
What's very strange about him is that we've given him a... What's very strange about him is, I don't comprehend, so sometimes I think I'm more challenged than he is that we've given him a mobile phone so that, we know his whereabouts and stuff like that. And he is able to call up people. I've just kept a few numbers on it. I know he can't read, but he manages to call the exact person, and there are no photographs assigned to those numbers. So, I am clueless about how to go about getting this child to actually read, because I think he's beyond flashcards and all. He's not going to sit down with me and do flashcards and stuff. He's 29.
No.
He won't even anyway sit with me.
Oh, well, what we have to do is make it something he does want to do. So, what Rhonda was saying yesterday about if they want to do it, if it's in a context and it's something they want to do, they will do it. It's finding that hook, isn't it? It's finding that, what does he want to learn? What would make this important for him? So if you learn this, you can do X. It's finding that way in. But, yeah, try it, please. Oh, I think we're out of time. But are we yes. Yes. Happy to answer at breaks and lunchtimes. Yes.